as today, I welcome you all to the second Fireside Chat, and I welcome up a Dr. Tommy Gibbons.
Good afternoon. Great to see you all. Thanks for being here. And it's my pleasure to speak to you on a hard saying of Jesus. So when Adam reached out to me, that was the request. Could you speak on a hard saying of Jesus? So I came up with one particular hard saying of Jesus that we will discuss, and I'll read here in a second. But I think what I want to do, just so you know where I'm headed, is spend maybe about 25, 30 minutes talking to you, hopefully not putting you to sleep, and give a little bit more time maybe than was originally scheduled for you to respond and for us to talk to each other. So maybe a little less from me monologuing up here and a little more of us talking to each other, if that's okay. So that's my plan. So the hard saying of Jesus comes from Matthew 19, and I think it'll come up here on the screen in a second. But in the meantime, let me read it to you, and it is Matthew 19, verse 9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, sometimes that's translated infidelity, could maybe translate it as sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So what this seems to say is that anytime there is a divorce, unless it's for the reason of infidelity, it results in adultery. And you can probably imagine why this is a hard saying of Jesus. And so that's where I want to start. Why is this hard? It's hard because it seems to foreclose on all kinds of reasons that we all probably intuitively imagine are appropriate why someone might be divorced. Maybe the most notorious case is when someone finds themselves in a marriage that's abusive, maybe even physically abusive, and yet they're told by authorities in their church or maybe their own study of the Bible that unless the person who is abusing them physically actually cheats on them, it's God's will that they stay in that marriage based upon this teaching. And the consequences, you can imagine, are really dreadful often. Someone who endures all kinds of mistreatment physically and otherwise because supposedly the only legitimate reason for that marriage to end is for the other partner to commit adultery by sleeping with someone else. That's why this is a hard saying. And so here's the first temptation that I think we have that I want to avoid when we come up against the hard saying of Jesus. The temptation that we face, that I'm going to try not to give in to today, is to explain it away. For me to do some kind of theatrics up here where I say, well, we don't really have to take seriously what Jesus' words seem to say. I think we do that a lot when we hear Jesus talking about how we're supposed to relate to enemies, for example. It's easier to simply explain it away than it is to face squarely what Jesus seems to be saying. So we're going to try to avoid explaining this away. We don't want to sort of domesticate Jesus, cut him down to size, something that we can stomach with maybe our suburban morals. Instead, we want to face the authority of Jesus' teaching, maybe even if it calls something about our life into question, even things that we hold dear because we're committed to following Jesus as the Lord, even if that means difficulties for us. So what are we going to do instead of explaining this away? And maybe you all can tell me at the end, by the way, if you think that I've explained it away, or if we've done what I am aiming to do. And that is to try to understand this teaching of Jesus in the flow of the story where these words appear, and according to the concerns that that story shows that these words have. Sometimes we would just say putting these words in context, but I want to be a little more specific than that. It's not just broadly in context. These words come in a story the story that we call Matthew's Gospel that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we want to try to hear these words as that story presents them and allow that to shape what we understand they're forced to be. I just want to pause and sort of highlight how unusual this is. Most of us, all of us, are very familiar with the Bible that is in one book, like this, and divided up into fragments that we call verses and chapters. And the way we know the words of the Bible is usually as those fragments, kind of free-floating words. And that's what we sort of hear the Bible to say, and that's how we take it seriously, is by trying to believe whatever's on the bumper sticker, the slogan that is the length of a verse. So what I want to try to impress upon you is that that's a very strange way to actually interact with the words of the Bible in the history of the church. The chapters and verses that we have in the Bible didn't come along until 13th, 14th century. So the Bible lived for over 1,000 years, complete, without being divided up into chapters and verses. So that when people would hear a reading of Matthew's Gospel as part of a lectionary in a church service, they would hear a big chunk of it and understand the words as part of that bigger story, bigger picture. So we've inherited and kind of developed a certain problem with the Bible because we've kind of broken it down into fragments that we call verses and chapters, and then that becomes the frame of reference that we have. And that then makes this sound like just a free-floating saying of Jesus, and we don't know why he's saying it, where he's saying it, to whom he's saying it, what's going on in the story. And that's something, just so you all know, at seminary, I'm fighting really hard because I think that's not served us well as Christians to treat the Bible this way. Maybe as an illustration, this will kind of tell you what we're about to do. If you think about another form of art similar to books that we are all familiar with, that today we call movies or film. All of us, I think, know intuitively by being shaped by our culture today that it would be a mistake to drop into a movie like a parachute into minute 32 and listen to one line from one character and think that you understood what that character was saying and what was at stake. We know that you're not going to understand the words of a movie very well if you parachute into them like that. Bounce from minute 12 to minute 83, back to 42, take a break for a week, come back and listen to 2 minutes again at minute 111. Can you imagine what sense of a movie that you would have if that's how you experienced it? It would just be a hodgepodge of fragments. You'd never actually have seen the movie. I think that's what we do with the Bible. So what we want to try to do with Matthew's Gospel right now, to stick with the analogy, is try to make sense of these words that are up on the screen here, in the flow of the movie of Matthew. What's going on when Jesus says this? What's been happening? How does that help us not to explain these words away, but to have a clearer sense of what is their aim? What force do they have? What are they trying to address? For us to think that Jesus is just giving a categorical rule about when you can and can't get divorced, I think is a colossal mistake, because it's lifting these words out of the fabric of their story and turning them into a kind of categorical rule, which is not what Jesus is up to at all here in Matthew's Gospel. So you with me so far on what we're trying to do? Okay, so next stage is we're going to try to drop these words from Matthew's Gospel into the narrative. So if you have Matthew open in front of you, that's great, but if you don't, that's totally fine. We are in part of the story of Matthew where Jesus has been drawing massive crowds with the authority of his teaching, with deeds of power, healing, banquets for people in the wilderness, all kinds of chatter in his generation about what is happening, who this person is. And he takes his disciples away from the crowds and he asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" Remember that famous question? And they say, for the first time, openly to him in the whole story of Matthew, "You are the Messiah, the King that we've been waiting for, the one who inherits God's ruling power in the world to be the King of all kings, the Son of God." Jesus then proceeds to tell them that what it means for him to be the Messiah is to go and die a shameful death at the hands of the corrupt government in Jerusalem. And you can imagine how that went over. That doesn't sound like deliverance. It doesn't sound like what we need according to the prophets from this king that we're waiting for. And yet Jesus says this is what it means for him to be the Messiah, and this is what they're called to follow. A life of resistance, struggling for truthfulness, for justice, for peacemaking in a time of conflict, but one that will cost you maybe the public shame of execution by your enemies. It's extremely difficult for them to stomach. And if we think that it's easy for us to stomach, then my sense is we haven't heard very clearly what Jesus is saying it means to follow him. From this point in Matthew, if we're thinking about it as a movie, Jesus begins a kind of march on Jerusalem. And along the way, he focuses really narrowly on his disciples, especially the 12, teaching them about what sort of life he means to inaugurate and to spread in Israel, in his generation, through them. So that's the context in which we're about to hear these words. He tells them, for example, when they're thinking about who is going to be in charge, who is going to have the most power, who's going to be the most authoritative, he brings a little child in front of them and says, this is the most powerful person. This kind of humble life is what we're going to organize our entire community's existence around, caring for this kind of person. What do we do when people challenge our authority, the disciples ask? When people hurt us, when they embarrass us publicly, when we need to make an example of them to deter that kind of disrespect. And Jesus says, well, yes, sin has to be confronted, but the goal is not your honor. It's not maintaining the status quo. It's not ensuring the structure of power. It's actually the restoration of anyone who has harmed you, to make sure that they're not cast out and lose their place in this life together that you're building. You're going to be childlike even in the way that you deal with offenses against you. And the discipline that you're called to is a forgiveness, a restoration that's inexhaustible. You never get tired of doing it. This is where he tells the story of the shepherd that leaves behind the 99 and goes for the one. The slave who has to learn to forgive as much as he has been forgiven. It's in this context, as Jesus is going to Jerusalem teaching this way of community to his disciples, that we're told in Matthew 19 that he's confronted by some of the authorities of his people. So if you've got your Bible in front of you, this is what he says. When Jesus had finished teaching his disciples about this childlike way of living in community and forgiveness with each other, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Large crowds were following him. He was healing them, and some Pharisaic authorities came to him to test him. They asked, is it legal for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? So, they've asked Jesus a question that they expect to derail him in public. This is going to be a hard question for him to answer without hurting his popularity. That's what Jesus is facing. Jesus answers, appeals to the same authority that guides these legal rulers in their people. Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male plus female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. So that's Jesus' initial answer. It's not Is it ever lawful for a man to divorce his wife? But God made people who get married to stay married. That's Jesus' initial answer. So now maybe you can understand why they respond the way that they do. They say, well, we have it in the book of Exodus, we have it in Deuteronomy. Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce a wife? So they appeal to the law, which sets out to regulate divorce. Part of the concern in the law, if you consult it, is you don't want someone to have, especially a woman, to have been joined to a man and to be cast out, and she has no ability to provide for herself. And so the law requires that the man who wants to leave her give her a certificate of divorce so that she's actually able. Got to remember that there's no Social Security for people who are divorced in ancient Israel. So her well-being depends on her ability to remarry. So a certificate of divorce protects a vulnerable woman by making it official that she's no longer married to the man that's left her, and therefore to free her to be able to marry someone else. So they appeal to this rule and say, well, Moses seemed to say it was okay to be divorced. Why don't you say so? And notice what Jesus says in response. Verse 8 of chapter 10, it's because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. So the purpose of that law that Moses gave was to confront the hard-heartedness of men in Israel who were content to abandon their wives, profit from a new marriage themselves, and take no responsibility for the women or the children that they had hung out to dry. That was the reason why God regulated divorce through the law of Moses. That's the answer that Jesus gives. Then he says, verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for, what we've read, unchastity, infidelity, sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So what is Jesus trying to teach here? Is he just giving a categorical rule for when it's okay and not okay to be divorced? Doesn't seem to be what this issue is about. Instead, he's speaking to legal authorities who would like to be able to authorize divorce whenever men see fit to seek a divorce in Jesus' generation and want to sort of call upon Jesus to conform to that rule. And Jesus won't cooperate. He tells them, if you're so eager to be divorced and to authorize divorce, then what you're effectively allowing is adultery every time that you issue a ruling that allows a man to be divorced for any reason that he trumps up. What is Jesus trying to do? He's trying to protect, just the way the law of Moses did, people who are vulnerable in the social fabric. The people who pay the price for this sort of ruling by the authorities are women who are repudiated by their husbands, cast out, their children also exposed, and this is made legal by the way these authorities are interpreting the law in Israel. And so Jesus says to them, powerful men who control who can and can't get divorced, the way you guys are operating, whenever you authorize a divorce, unless it's for the reason that the woman has been joined to somebody else, you're actually authorizing adultery. So that's the kind of thing that I think Jesus is attempting to curb. That sort of permissive way of treating especially powerful men so that they can drop a marriage whenever they feel like it and move on. And against that tendency, Jesus teaches you're actually required to honor the commitment that you've made to the woman in your life. And that's what should be guiding your rulings in Israel. I don't think that the purpose here is to anticipate all of the different scenarios, all the different reasons why a marriage might break down, why people in a marriage might need, for a variety of reasons, space from one another, the ability to preserve their integrity physically or otherwise, those just lie, I think, beyond the scope here. The scope that Jesus is addressing is authorities who want to authorize men to divorce women for any reason. And his concern is to protect vulnerable women and their children. So in how we interpret these words, I hope that what we're going to do is not say, divorce is no big deal. We don't think marriage is an institution that we should be that attached to. I think that'd be a mistake. Clearly, we've got all kinds of biblical teaching that urges us to take marital vows and marital life very seriously, and this passage shouldn't be about cutting against that. But I hope we can also hear this as telling us that when we're considering marriages that are in crisis, marriages that are in difficulty, that while we want to advocate for those marriages to be preserved, for them to survive, our concern should be especially with the vulnerable people in those relationships. Who is being mistreated? Who is paying the price? And to allow that to inform the judgments that we make, the way we tell the story and talk about those relationships, those difficulties. That seems to be in line with what Jesus' concerns are here. Now, I didn't say much about it, but if we continue to read, we'll notice that this comes in a certain sequence of teaching that's not just about marriage and divorce as if this were some kind of random topic, but also about children. The next scene is when children come to Jesus, and his disciples think that Jesus is too important to have a lot of time for children, and Jesus says that the children should be allowed to come because the rule of God that he's bringing into the world belongs especially to them. And then we have teaching on wealth, the distribution of wealth. There's a wealthy man that comes and wants to inherit the life of this kingdom and asks Jesus what else he has to do because he's keeping the law as he sees it. And Jesus tells him he's got to sell the resources that he has so that he can be generous with needy people in his generation. Why do I say that? Because I think we tend to interpret this sequence of teaching in Matthew as if Jesus were just touching on a few random moral topics that happen to just appear in the Bible. But if you put this together, the institution of marriage, the place of children, how you distribute wealth, you're talking about the fundamental questions of any society. There is no society over generations if you don't have some way of instituting the bond between males and females that bring children into that society over time. That's why marriage is going to be something every society has to deal with in one way or another. Every society has to deal with how life passes from the old to the young. What place children have as they're being formed in that society. And every society has to deal with wealth. How you distribute it, how you receive it, what your concern is with others, with whatever power of wealth you happen to hold. So Jesus is teaching about fundamental questions for the sort of society that he is building, sharing in Israel that he expects to spread to the ends of the earth. And over the course of many generations has spread to us and embraced us. And here we find ourselves committed to learning the ways of Jesus as our own. So, looping back, when it comes to divorce, Jesus is not just giving us some categorical rule about a random moral topic. He's dealing with a fundamental question of human society, and he is urging that authorities not abuse their power at the expense of the vulnerable, but that they actually require that people who hold power, in this case, men over women, honor their commitments rather than giving up on them and seeking better marital alliances elsewhere. This is why Jesus is so assertively against divorce by these people in this context. Hopefully, as we draw from this, we're going to bring similar sensibilities to how we engage the difficulties of marital relationships, but not just, I don't think this is just about marital relationships. You got to think here that this is about all the ways in which some people in our society find that they have a significant measure of power over other people. Whether you're talking about employers, whether you're talking about how teachers relate to students, whether you're talking about how parents relate to children, whether how political authorities relate to others. The concern here is not just with marriage as an isolated institution, but as a key context in which power is exercised. And what Jesus teaches us is when that happens, our concern has to be especially with those who are vulnerable, those who are apt to be exploited and taken advantage of. The purpose of the law and Jesus' teaching is to instead promote a society where we're compassionately engaged in seeing to the needs of those weaker or more vulnerable parts in a relationship of power. So that's what I take this difficult saying of Jesus to be about. Curbing those sorts of abuses and advocating for a way of caring for one another that honors commitments, urges powerful people to honor their commitments, and protects people who are vulnerable and exposed. That's our job, I think, as a Christian community, to be seeing to those kinds of needs. And that's about 25 minutes from me. So this has probably raised questions for you. I should probably note, because I wish I would have read it, after Jesus says that this is how people are to exercise power with respect to the institution of marriage, his disciples, I think rather, what shall we say, insightfully say, well, maybe it would be better not to get married at all. And Jesus goes on to say, you might actually be right. Not what they were expecting him to say. And he urges them to consider becoming eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. This is not something you're going to hear in church sermons very often. Most of us grow up where there's a lot of concern about urging young people to couple up, to become faithful to one another, et cetera, et cetera. Here Jesus is teaching these young men in a context where marriage is key to how you inherit power over generations, that instead they should opt to be single if God gives them the gift to do that. So maybe you have questions about that in this context. Okay, we got a question right here.
So from here on out, never mind. Hold on. Okay. I just don't know what the internet can hear. Oh, they can hear me now. So from here on out, we're just going to field questions. Give me mercy and grace as I run to you to hand you your mic, and then we'll just kind of share this space generously with one another.
Your focus in your remarks is on divorce. But the scripture talks about divorce and remarry. That's what is adultery. Is there any problem with divorce without remarrying? It's from a scriptural standpoint.
Great question. So I appreciate you coming back, because you're right. The concern here most explicitly is what happens to you in a marriage if you want to be able to marry somebody else, and that's where divorce comes up. My sense is, following with the spirit of this teaching, that Jesus does not want to make it easy for married people to give up on each other. And based on who is gathered here today, I bet we all have the sense that marriage is not easy. And part of the challenge and the gift of it is to learn to stay committed to each other, even through times when it's very difficult. So I don't think I want to say that, oh yes, no problem with divorce as long as no remarriage is in view. But that said, I think that we need to be alert to when people find themselves in a relationship that is doing them great harm, and not to be the kind of community that is sort of attached to marriage in a way that we can't see that what this person needs in these circumstances is to not be bound to this person, whether they get remarried or not. So in the spirit of this, I would say, yes, there are cases when we ought to be able to encourage, allow someone in the community to seek a divorce, even if no remarriage is in view. Because what the teaching is concerned with is the well-being of vulnerable people. Thanks for the question.
Excellent question.
Who's next?
Hey, Tom.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, sir. So you began by mentioning those episodes where the people are now beginning to confess who Jesus is. And one of the things I understood in this particular story is that location is important in understand. One of the ways to understand this particular text. Location. Why? Because it's at this time where Jesus is standing, where he got baptized in the River Jordan, and it is Jesus where it is also where I believe John condemned the marriage of Herod to and Mary's Herod's brother's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in one of my readings, I was led to understand that it was important for this question to be asked because it was a question within a bigger question that this Pharisee was asking. This Pharisee was really asking was that, do you have the courage that your cousin have in asking, in condemning Herod? And are you able to do that when people are now confessing that you are the king or the Messiah?
Yeah, great suggestion. And I have to say, I'm pretty sympathetic with that because what has happened earlier in Matthew, it's like the earlier parts of a movie that hasn't sort of disappeared from view. So this scene is taking place in a familiar location in the drama of Matthew, and already serious, powerful events have taken place here for Jesus's predecessor, the one who was preparing the way for him to have been beheaded. Makes it clear that the stakes are very high. We have a brutal regime that when it is challenged and begins to see a threat because people gravitate to a prophetic figure and will resort to that kind of brutality, there's a lot at stake when someone who has any standing comes up to Jesus in a public place, precisely where John had been gathering people, and says, is it okay to be divorced? Knowing that there's this celebrated case of wife trading that's been going on with the Herodian family in the region. So, yes, I think that would be something on people's minds. The other thing I guess I would add is this is a test, a word that's spoken to Jesus by powerful people in the land. You don't cross these authorities lightly. There are consequences if in a public place where the dominant ruling authorities in the land ask you a question and you oppose them, maybe even make them look bad, there's going to be an aftermath to that, not only with Herod, but with these authorities. And then it's also a risk with the people. I mean, we're in the midst of political campaign season, which I'm kind of exhausted by myself. You guys probably are too. But there's this constant effort to get candidates to commit some kind of gaffe in public that would undermine their public support. And I think that too is what Jesus is facing. You can imagine there would be a lot of relatively wealthy men listening to Jesus, the same kind of men that do a lot of donating to campaigns in our political culture, who do not want to hear Jesus say, no, you actually don't have the freedom to drop one wife and get another when you wish to. So there are all kinds of ways in which Jesus is not doing a very good job if he's trying to get elected with what he's saying, because it seems like that's not actually his concern. His concern is not to win the praise of the powerful that would put him on the throne, but to say something that's true, even if it costs him a position of dominance in his society. That's hard for us because I don't think we want to be naive. Jesus is not unconcerned about power. He's not simply running away from conflict. He's right in the heart of it. So this is not about withdrawing. But the goal is not to win in some easy contest for who comes out on top. The goal is the kingdom of God, the quality of life that comes when God is ruling in people's hearts and relationships. So, good to highlight maybe the larger political context that is pressuring this encounter between Jesus and prominent authorities in the Judean wilderness as he's getting ready to climb up the valley to Jerusalem. Thanks for the question.
You're saying that Jesus is defending or speaking up for the disadvantaged, the poor, those that don't have any authority, the women, we'll say in this case. Mm-hmm. And he's trying to preserve that marriage. How can we facilitate that? How can we help preserve the marriage? And yet giving them the space to work it out.
Yeah.
It's kind of a tough call, I think.
Yeah.
And also, later on, I forgot where it is. There's another one where it says that if you look at a woman and think about that, you're committing adultery.
Yeah.
And
that is in the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay.
Maybe that's what was advertised, as
Yeah.
Adam was saying.
How'd you get away from that?
Yeah.
Put blindfolds on? Or
Okay, so let's take these in turn. The first question about the real challenge of trying to safeguard, preserve a marriage, but not in a way that's going to trample someone who's vulnerable in that marriage. I think the first thing that I would say that makes this difficult in our context is if people are becoming involved in a marital relationship sort of only when it's about to fall apart, then you've neglected a lot of the tools that we have at our disposal to try to support married couples. So I would say, first of all, we want to promote the kind of community where people are being supported in their marriages, in their single lives, meaningfully, long before they find themselves in a crisis. Because if you just try to sort of swoop in with a rule from the Bible in the midst of a crisis, I think you'll often do more harm than good. So that's my first plea, is that we try to promote a way of living together where if things are not going well in your marriage, you're not ashamed to talk about that. You're not deprived of some setting in the church community's life where that's something you are expected to be able to share and to receive support of any number of kinds as you try to save that marriage. So my first answer is we got to mobilize the whole complex of a community's life to support married couples long before they find themselves in a crisis if we're going to promote healthy marriage in our communities. I think being meaningfully involved in one another's lives is then what would give us the kind of knowledge to make sound judgments about when are we going to say, we got to try to stick this out a little longer and encourage someone to do that, and when are we going to say, hey, maybe it's time to recognize that this marriage is just not going to be able to survive, and for the two of you to be healthy people. I don't know how you make that kind of call from a safe distance or just with a rule from the Bible. That seems to me to be something that only friends do with and for each other, where there's trust, where there's investment in one another's lives, where there's an intimate knowledge of what someone has been dealing with, and sound judgment that goes with that kind of involvement with each other. So I don't have a formula for how to always get that right, but I would just say that the tendency that we have sometimes is to sort of look to the Bible for some code that we're going to get that's going to solve that problem for us. And I think if we look for that in the Bible, we'll find something that's not actually there. Instead, we want the wisdom of Scripture to inform more ongoing, complicated way of connecting with each other, learning to love each other. And then I think we got at least a chance of making a good judgment in that kind of a situation. So I feel like in our day, we live in a society where more than half of people who get married end up getting divorced. I don't think that's something to celebrate. That doesn't seem to me to be healthy. But the tendency is to react to that by making it taboo for people to consider divorce or to be divorced or for people to feel shame when they have undergone a divorce. And that strikes me as equally mistaken. So avoiding those extremes, hopefully we can promote a healthier way of understanding the commitments of marriage.
This kind of taps into my general comment and question is this verse and this kind of conflict that Jesus is presented with from the Pharisees emphasizes the turmoil of divorce. Whereas Jesus here is trying to underline, although he talks explicitly about divorce, what he's really doing is trying to underline the virtues of marriage. And then you bring it to, what do we do with that now? And when we're sitting in a society where 51% of divorces or marriages end in divorce.
It's like 55, actually.
Well, it's only increased, yeah. What does that say to us? And maybe where do we go from that? And you kind of already alluded to it about marriage versus just focusing on when am I allowed to get divorced? How do we then cultivate a group or maybe a community that uplifts, encourages, enables, gets into the sticky nitty-gritty of marriage, which is what you kicked off with, which is very hard.
Yeah. Well, there's probably a lot of good answers to that question, but I'll tell you, let me just reflect personally on this. I got married at 20, which might be relatively familiar to some of us, but pretty unusual for my generation and even less common now. And I don't think that we made a mistake. Kim is here with me. We're still together. But I will say that what we inherited, the way we grew up in church, Kim didn't grow up in church quite the way that I did. But I would say we were fed a kind of romance of marriage. Obviously, everybody was eager to be able to sleep with each other. And this was often what would urge you to rush into marriage when it was sort of frowned upon to live together before getting married in our generation. But generally speaking, you think about sort of what we see with a lot of films up until recently that end with a happy marriage a lot of times. You sort of grow up with this sense that marriage is awesome. And then this sickening feeling begins to grow in you when your marriage doesn't feel like that. When within a relatively short period of time, you're not experiencing all of the amazing things that everybody told you was going to happen when you get married. So I think one key is to be much more truthful with young people about how difficult marriage often is, and to make sure that the rewards and the gifts of marriage are presented to them in a way that gives them a sense of what that costs. What difficulties they're going to have to face personally, with their partner, all kinds of other things, in order to enjoy what we want to tell them are the gifts and the rewards of marriage. So a more truthful way of telling stories about being married, I think, would really help sort of counter this tendency of people to have these sort of rose-colored glasses about marriage when they're young. I don't want to neglect the second question that you asked me, which was about another hard saying of Jesus. And this is in his manifesto about the kingdom coming from heaven, his first teaching in Matthew. And there's a whole series of sort of lines that Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And it's one of those where Jesus is talking, he says, "You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that whoever looks upon a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. That's the hard saying, right? You guys remember Jimmy Carter's blunder about this? Okay, so Jimmy Carter, who just turned 100, but there was a really bad moment in his own, I think he was campaigning, I can't remember if this was during his presidency, I think it was before. Might have been during the second campaign that he lost. But he was asked if he had ever been unfaithful to his wife. And instead of just giving a nice, clean answer of, no, I haven't, he said, well, you know, if you listen to Jesus, who tells us that if you've looked upon a woman lustfully, then you've committed adultery in your heart, I can't say that. Well, and he just sort of muddied the waters, and the media, you know, there was a feeding frenzy to assassinate his character based upon that. Anyway. What is Jesus up to there in what we call the Sermon on the Mount? So I'd do something similar there that I've tried to do here, placing it sort of in the flow of the story and see what his concerns are. I don't think, if you listen carefully, that the goal is to make people feel really bad for all of the adultery that they're committing all the time because they're having lustful thoughts about other people in their life. He's teaching, again, against certain predominant ways that have come in his generation from the authorities. He's just said that unless your justice surpasses that of some of these scribes and Pharisaic authorities that have been guiding us, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying what we have been trying to do in our society is not enough. We haven't been taking the law seriously enough. And so this is one of a whole sequence of, you've heard it said by the authorities of our day, but I'm going to say that we got to do more. They've been saying that love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's not enough, he says, when it comes to loving your neighbor. Instead, we're going to love our neighbor so much that we lean into even loving people who mistreat us, to not give up on those relationships. That's, he says, what loving your neighbor actually entails. That's what it's about. He says something similar about other commandments. The way that they're being interpreted is, let's set the bar as low as we can so that we can count ourselves as obedient. So, could be a matter of stealing. You know, you shouldn't steal. I'm going to make sure I haven't sort of done the bare minimum of stealing. And Jesus says that's not actually what that command in the law of Moses that you shouldn't steal is about. It's actually about learning to care for someone else's life, their land, their livestock, their relationships. So it's not just make sure you don't take anything away. It's make sure you're invested in their well-being in the same way that you are in yours, loving your neighbor as yourself. So, adultery is the command, thou shalt not commit adultery, just about make sure that whatever you're going to do with your neighbor's wife, you don't end up in the same bed. That's not enough, Jesus says. The whole point is that you would allow that command against adultery to shape your appetites, your habits, your life, your relationships, so that your eye doesn't even drift over to your neighbor's wife and think that she might be for you. Instead, you're cultivating a way of treating one another that's just not what you want out of a woman, or let's just make it gender neutral, a man, someone who's sexually desirable in your life. You're not treating them as an object for your gratification. You're learning to invest your life in theirs so that you're not thinking of them as just an object of sexual appetite. So I don't think the point is to make sure you feel guilty every time, especially in a culture like ours that's just hypersexualized, saturated with images that are designed to tempt us and taunt us. I think the point is, learn that these commands, like against adultery, are actually about learning new habits, learning new appetites, a whole way of treating one another, not just the minimum bar that you want to make sure that you clear so that you can say, I'm obedient to God's law. That's not the goal. Does that make sense? So that's what I think he's on to there in Matthew 5. Great question.
Excellent question.
And maybe we've done a little justice to the advertising, since apparently I was supposed to talk about that one the whole time.
And that's what we're here for. Just fulfill the advertising. One or two?
One or two more?
More? Two more?
Don't be shy.
7 more. Any more at all? How many of you have either personally experienced divorce or been within a family that has experienced divorce?
I got
This is not some foreign topic that doesn't relate to how we live our lives with and maybe for one another. And I personally am very thankful that we have had Tommy come and just talk about what Jesus has to say about the topic, because it is intimate to our lives and how we deal with it. Everyone, can you please give a round of applause for Tommy?